harvest of your land. You shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyards bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall swear by my name. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress or your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. The Word of God for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. So God, in calling Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob and the nation of Israel, He called them and formed them to be a community of faith, to trust in Him with all their heart and soul, mind and strength, and to love Him. And He called them to be a community of love one to another. He was forming them to be a community of love, and He called them to love each other, to love their fellow brothers and sisters who were natives of the nation of Israel, as well as the foreigner who would reside among them. So when we think about what does it mean to love your neighbor, this is a very confused thing, and especially now in our day and time. Love is one of the most, if not the most, one of the most misunderstood concepts in the church today in the Western world, in America. Love is used oftentimes as an excuse to allow sin to continue to flourish in people's lives. But God has something different in mind. Love is oftentimes used as an excuse to be permissive and to not get involved in anybody else's life or in anybody else's business. But that's not the way love is described here. Somebody came to Jesus in His day. There were different questions and ideas about what were the greatest of the commandments that God had given in the law. And of course, number one would be, you shall have no other gods before me. And the way that Deuteronomy puts that in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is that you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. And Jesus adds, with all of your mind, with everything that you have. You'll love the Lord your God, not with part of it, but with all of it. So they all understood that was the greatest of the commandments, but there was a question about what was next. And so Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And He expresses that one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then He says there's another one like it. Now, a lot of times people in His day thought that the next greatest commandment would be to honor your father and your mother. And it's one of the great commandments, but Jesus didn't go there. He actually said, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is the second greatest commandment, and it's like the first, and it's completely connected to the first. You can't really fulfill one without the other. Now what Jesus was not doing there was he was not saying, hey, these are the only 2 laws that are important. You can ignore the rest. That's the way, in the name of love today, that's the way that passage and what Jesus said is often interpreted. That you can use love as an excuse to ignore the rest. That's not what Jesus is saying. He says, on these 2 laws hang all of the law and all of the prophets. All of the others, this is what all of them are about. And here in Leviticus, and he's quoting, when Jesus is asked, he's quoting this verse. He's actually just quoting the second half of Leviticus 19:18. And that verse, or that phrase that says, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself, that's a summary phrase. And in order to understand what that really means, we back up to verse 9 and begin again and see that what it means to love your neighbor is to help your neighbor. To help your neighbor when they're in need. And your neighbor includes, in this passage we see, your neighbor includes those who are your brothers and sisters, the natives of Israel, and the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and those who would be sojourners, is the word that's used, and that would be a foreigner. Now, you are to love your neighbor. That includes your brother or sister, your fellow Israelite, and anyone else who is dwelling peacefully among you. I don't think immigrant here really captures the full flavor of the term. It can include someone who would go from tribe to tribe and place to place within the wider geographical area. But really, the thing you need to understand here, most of the time, is referring to one of the original inhabitants of this land that God had taken from the Canaanites in judgment and given it to the Israelites, which hasn't happened yet, by the way, in this passage that we're looking at. This is going into the future. So that brings up a lot of questions, I know, and I can't get into all of that today. But you're to love your neighbor. One of the leaders later in the story of David, the great King David, one of the leaders in his army that ended up being very mistreated, and unjustly so, by David, was a man named Uriah. And Uriah was a Hittite. He was one of the original inhabitants. These would be people who would not necessarily become Israelites, but they would be pleased to dwell peacefully among the Israelites. That will be helpful when we get later on into the story about what's really going on with this transfer of ownership or control of the land. But nevertheless, your neighbor is your brother, your sister, or the foreigner dwelling among you. And you're to help those who are in need. Now, the responsibility here for helping those in need was not placed in a land far, far away, in a high ivory tower far, far away. The responsibility, what you need to understand, is that power follows responsibility. Okay, whoever has the responsibility has the power. Here, the power and the responsibility that came along with it was on the local community. It was on the local landowners to make sure they made provision for those who would be in need. God promised, and He did, He would bless the nation of Israel above and beyond all the nations of the face of the earth. He said, you'll be blessed, you'll be wealthy, you'll be prosperous, but that doesn't mean those promises were for every single individual. There would be some people in the land who would, through no fault of their own, would, because of disability, because of destitution, a lot of times widows or orphans, they would find themselves in need and at the mercy of others to help them. And it was the responsibility of the local landowners to do so, to use their own property to meet the needs of others. We actually see the same principle play out in the New Testament. At the beginning of the New Testament, the same principles where people used what they had as the need would arise among them in the early church They would use the wealth that they had, and they would sell it in certain circumstances and give it to the widows, the orphans, or those others in need. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some utopian communist society as is often claimed, and it's a claim that's being made by some prominent ministers, even from North Carolina today. One is a guy named William Barber. He just recently said, I think he's a graduate of Duke Divinity School, but he just recently said that the Bible teaches socialism. Okay. All right, that's not what is going on here in Leviticus 19. Okay, that's certainly not what's going on here. And it's not what's going on in the early church. The early church, like in the case of Ananias and Sapphira I mentioned last week, the problem with them is that they sold their property, but they held back and lied about how much they were given. Peter said, look, what you had was yours to do with what you would. The problem wasn't that they held back the property, refused to give up their property. The property, they lied about it. That was the problem. So everybody still retained their private property. And they used it voluntarily. They weren't forced to use it. They, out of the goodness of their heart, used it voluntarily to help people in need. Okay? So we can't do away with the idea that private property is still important. Okay? The idea that private property is a problem. You know, sometimes this is what socialists, Marxists, communists have always said, private property creates a problem. Well, you can't understand something as basic as you shall not steal without a concept of what's yours is yours and not mine. Okay? What belongs to you, I can't just come and confiscate because I have more power than you. You understand what I'm saying here?
Yes.
Okay. It's called covetousness, coveting other people's things. It's a commandment, one of the 10, the number 10. Okay, and there's a story in 1 Kings chapter 21. See, this is long after the prophet Samuel would warn Israel, because they began to ask for a king like all the other nations had, because they wanted a king, a powerful king, to take care of them. Now remember, the power follows the what? Responsibility. So whoever ends up with the responsibility of care has the power. So they wanted a king to take care of them. God through Samuel warned them that if you do this, that king will eventually confiscate your property and enslave you and force you into forced labor and conscript you into their armies to fight their wars and so on and so forth. But God gave the people what they wanted. Have I ever told you that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is for God to give you what you want? One of the worst things. God said, okay, I'm going to give you what you want, but this is what's going to happen. Well, long after that, there was this king named Ahab. He had a wife you may have heard of. Her name was Jezebel. Okay? And Ahab had set his mind on a vineyard that he wanted to purchase or trade for. And it belonged to a man who was far less powerful, far less wealthy, a man named Naboth. Ahab set his mind and said, I want that vineyard. So he offered to buy it, and he offered to trade for it. And Naboth said, no, this is my family inheritance. This is my family land. I don't want to sell it. Well, Ahab went with his tail between his legs. He was sulking and he was sad. And his wife Jezebel comes to him and says, look, what's the problem here? And he says, well, I want Naboth's vineyard and he won't let me have it. And she said, well, we'll fix him. So she set up people to bear false witness. We've heard a little bit about that already in Leviticus 19. Against Naboth to falsely accuse him of a crime he did not commit. And eventually Naboth was, because of the false witness, was executed. And then Ahab and Jezebel went in and confiscated the land. Now let me tell you how God felt about this. Okay, God, he was up in the heavens and looking down and seeing all this take place. And he said, who am I to judge? Who am I really to judge? That's just, how Ahab and Jezebel are. So he just wiped his hands up and said, oh, don't worry about it. Do you believe that?
No.
No, he sent this guy named Elijah. to go have a conversation with Ahab and to confront Ahab about the injustice that he had perpetrated. And he pronounced severe judgment that would fall on that house of Ahab. But the story's got some good news in it. The story goes on to tell us that Ahab actually repented. And he humbled himself. And because he did, God withheld some of the judgment that was to come. There were still consequences, but God withheld some of the judgment that was to come. Now, Ahab was loved by Elijah. Elijah, he probably thought initially, hey, who are you to tell me? Don't you know who I am? But he humbled himself and he listened. Ahab was loved by Elijah. So, loving our neighbor requires us to respect the property, the belongings of our neighbor, and to deal with each other respectfully in that regard and honestly in our dealings with one another. We're not to misrepresent things or to fudge the facts on things in order to get an advantage over other people. We're to be honest in our dealings. And then in verse 13, we also see that in order for us to love our neighbor, see, this context is telling us how to love our neighbor. In the context, we do not take advantage of our neighbor because of their vulnerable situation. Whether because they're poor, because they're a foreigner or sojourner, or because they may be disabled, blind or deaf, or some other disability that they may have. And there are all kinds of different disabilities that people have. That among the people of God, the vulnerable are to be cared for, not taken advantage of, or discarded or disregarded, for that matter. Are you with me today?
Yes.
So when a society becomes really wicked, we begin to look at the vulnerable. We begin to look at the lessly abled as a deficiency and a detraction from our society. And we come up with ways to discard them and disregard them. And it's getting pretty egregious in some circumstances. I just saw an article yesterday where a disabled man in Canada, the Canadian government decided that they had spent too much on his health care. They have, in Canada as well as other countries now, they have what's called euthanasia that's legalized. Okay? Euthanasia is a more pleasant term for murder. Okay? And people can actually choose to have themselves killed by authority. This is happening more and more. And oftentimes this is done in the name of compassion. But this man said he didn't want to die, but he felt like he had no other choice and he was pressured. And he was euthanized. Okay? So Canada's not that far away, is it? Evil's even closer. Evil is even closer. So people can come up with all kinds of reasons to justify that, but what it comes down to is a disregard and a discarding of the weak and the vulnerable. And this is happening in many, many, many different ways. So we're not to take advantage of situation. We're not to take advantage of those who are in need or those who may be disabled. But in order to love our neighbor, we're supposed to care for our neighbor, even the weak and the vulnerable. Verse 15, he says here in verse 15, he says, we're to show no partiality for the poor or for the rich when it comes to justice. That there's not to be one set of rules for some people and another set of rules for other people. And it doesn't matter if they're weak as well. If someone has committed a crime and done something that's wrong, they're to be held to the same standard. It doesn't matter if they are of the same political party as you, or if they're of the same neighborhood that you come from, the same color as you, that everyone is to be treated the same in the eyes of the law. This is a principle we kind of value, but we're losing today. There are some, as George Orwell said in some of his novels and things he wrote, there's some who are more equal than others, and that should not be. There should be equal justice, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. So we shouldn't show favoritism to the powerful out of greed and selfishness, and we should not show favoritism for the weak and the vulnerable and the poor out of excessive compassion that a lot of times is just simply driven by pride. We become prideful and think we're going to solve all of the world's problems, and we can just figure it out. We can just come up with the right technology. We can come up with the right programs or the right legislation, and that everything's going to be solved. We're going to create this utopia ourselves. And a lot of times it's done, a lot of evil is done in the world and has been done in the world, not just in the name of greed, but also in the name of excessive compassion. We have to have equal justice under the law. No special exemptions and no special favors. Verse 16 talks about the sin of gossip and going around and bad-mouthing our neighbor, talking bad about our neighbor. Even if we may have a reason, even if our neighbor has done something wrong, what we're supposed to do, as we will see, is go to our neighbor. But what we most of the time do if we're offended or we feel slighted, a lot of times we won't go to our neighbor, we'll go to everybody else. Right? We'll get on the party line and the hotline for gossip. And that is what he's saying we should avoid. Not to speak ill or evil of our neighbor, and to certainly not make up lies and slander about our neighbor. Our country thrives on this. Our country is like this. This is one of the most important forms of entertainment. A lot of the talk shows, Jerry Springer, Maury Povich, or whatever his name is, even a lot of cable news shows. It's all about gossip and slander. It's all about floating innuendo. In verse 17, in order to love our neighbor, he tells us here, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. But instead of hating your brother, listen to what he's saying here, you shall reason frankly, honestly, openly with your neighbor. What is he talking about? Well, what he's saying is that among the community of God, among the people of God, if we're going to really love one another, we have to hold one another accountable. In other words, we have to judge one another in a positive way, in a good way, and according to the right standards. See, Jesus, when he said, and this is one of the most misquoted verses, and this is what people actually think love is now. They think that what it means to love is you just pretty much ignore anything your neighbors do. We can't do that. We don't ever do that. Okay? We don't do that. We end up gossiping and slandering and all kinds of stuff anyway, instead of actually dealing with situations. But when Jesus said, listen to what he said here. He says, judge not. There's not a period. It's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. He doesn't say, judge not, exclamation mark, period, in the story. He says, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So the issue at hand is, what standard are you judging by? Are we judging other people by our own whims and our own desires and our own feelings of what's right or wrong or what's good for us or beneficial for us? Or are we judging, and if we're doing that, we're going to be showing partiality. Okay. Or are we judging according to God's standard of what's right and wrong? He goes on to tell us actually how to judge. Because one of the very next things he says is, why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but you do not see the log that's in your own eye? So first remove the log that's in your own eye, then you shall see to remove the speck that's in your neighbor's eye. He doesn't say ignore the speck. Okay, you see the difference there. Doesn't say what happens if you ignore the speck. What's going to happen to the man or woman's eye? It's going to get infected. It's going to start to fester. It's going to get worse. take the log out, then you shall see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Then this is what Jesus says here. Do not give dogs what is holy. Do not give dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before pigs. In other words, you're not to judge according to your own whims or desires, your own standards, or own likes or dislikes, or what's beneficial for you, but you're to judge according to God's Word. Recognizing that we ourselves, all of us, are also prone to sin and are sinners ourselves. But in order to really love, we have to judge. If we're going to learn how to love again in the church, we have to learn how to judge again. I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people today, but it's absolutely true. To judge rightly and to judge truly, as we're called to hold each other accountable in love. In other words, if we don't, Leviticus is saying, look, you hate your neighbor. You hate your neighbor. Has anybody seen the movie Doubt? I watched this movie called Doubt. It's about a Roman Catholic parish, and there's a Roman Catholic priest, and there's a school at the parish there. And the principal of the school is the head nun as well. And one of the priests, he is beginning to have this inappropriate relationship with one of the students. Now this is based on true stories, of course, because we've heard these stories, right? And this head nun and this principal of school, she recognizes something's not right here. And she begins to confront this priest. And of course he's denying, he's lying, and he's trying to cover his tracks. And then he pulls out the compassion card. And he's not admitting to anything, but he's trying to use the idea of her being compassionate to him so he can continue on in his position and eventually be able to continue on doing what he should not be doing. Okay. So what does this nun do? She's having none of it. She's all up in his grill. She's saying, you're not going to get away with this. You're going to resign. You're going to step down. And he thought, she's just being mean. She's just being nasty. He accused her of being backwards. He accused her of being old-fashioned. Because there's nothing wrong with loving somebody else, and so on and so forth. And she was having none of it. But she was not hating him. And she certainly wasn't hating those students. Do you agree? Was she loving those students?
Yes.
That's what it means to be a community of love. Of love. Sometimes love's tough. I know I told Stacy this was going to be a short sermon, and I'm sorry, Stacy. I've gotten carried away. I get excited about the Word of God, okay? So, listen. Sometimes love's tough. Now, Grace came home a few times when she was in North Iredell High School last year, and she was just kind of upset with a teacher over there. The teacher was giving her what for about not trying as hard as she could in her calculus class and not doing her best. And she would send these emails out to say, we need to talk, kind of an email. And Grace was like, I was just so mad at that woman. I was like, I was making pretty good grades. I'm making A's, and she's, challenging me, saying I'm not doing my best. And she goes, eventually I started to listen to what she was saying, and I started applying what she was saying, and I started doing even far, far better. It ended up making, I think, the highest grade in that class, if I remember, that anybody's ever made. And ended up winning the math award. And she looked back and she at first she could have said, well, I can't stand that woman. She goes, after it was all over, I love that woman. You know why? Because that woman loved her. That woman loved her. That's what it means to be a community of love. So sometimes the people who love us the most are sometimes the ones who challenge us the most. And that's what is going on in Leviticus 19. That's what it means to love your neighbor as you love yourself.